Hi, welcome to the quiz. You can answer along on quizalto.com, all for free. The exact URL of this quiz will be in the notes down below. Let's get started, good luck. Where can you store environment variables for AWS Lambda functions? In AWS CloudFormation. In Amazon RDS. In the Lambda console. In Amazon S3. Environment variables for AWS Lambda functions can be set and managed in the Lambda console. What is an example of an event source for AWS Lambda? AWS Glue Job Event. Amazon S3 Bucket Event. Amazon Redshift Cluster Event. Amazon RDS Database Event. An Amazon S3 bucket event, such as an object creation, can serve as an event source for triggering an AWS Lambda function. What is AWS Lambda's relationship with AWS X-Ray? AWS X-Ray can be used to trace and analyze requests. AWS X-Ray stores Lambda function code. AWS X-Ray manages Lambda function permissions. AWS X-Ray monitors Lambda billing. AWS X-Ray can trace and analyze requests as they travel through your AWS Lambda functions, providing insights into performance bottlenecks and errors. How does AWS Lambda handle failures during execution? By automatically scaling resources. By stopping execution immediately. By automatically retrying the execution twice for asynchronous invocations. By sending an alert and stopping execution. For asynchronous invocations, AWS Lambda automatically retries the execution twice if it fails initially. How does AWS Lambda interact with other AWS services? Using Amazon SNS to invoke functions. Using CloudWatch logs to trigger actions. Using IAM roles to grant permissions. Using AWS config rules. AWS Lambda uses IAM roles to grant functions the necessary permissions to interact with other AWS services. What is the primary use of AWS Lambda's function URL? To store logs generated by the function. To set memory limits for the function. To manage environment variables. To provide a built-in HTTPS endpoint for the function. AWS Lambda function URLs provide built-in HTTPS endpoints to invoke your function without needing an API gateway. What is AWS Lambda Snapstart? A feature that scales Lambda functions. A feature that monitors Lambda functions. A feature that improves startup performance by caching and reusing snapshots of execution environments. A feature that secures Lambda functions. AWS Lambda Snapstart is designed to improve startup performance by creating and caching snapshots of execution environments, reducing cold start latency. What type of code can AWS Lambda run? Neither synchronous nor asynchronous. Both synchronous and asynchronous. Only synchronous. Only asynchronous. AWS Lambda can run both synchronous and asynchronous code. What is AWS Lambda's destination feature? It monitors the memory usage of Lambda functions. It manages the VPC settings of Lambda functions. It stores the code of Lambda functions. It allows you to route the outcome of a function execution to other services. AWS Lambda's destination feature allows you to send the outcome of a function execution to other AWS services, such as SNS, SQS, Lambda, or EventBridge. Which of the following is a best practice for writing AWS Lambda functions? Writing monolithic functions. Maximizing the memory allocation to all functions. Using synchronous code only. Minimizing the function's package size. Minimizing the function's package size helps reduce cold start times and improve performance. Can AWS Lambda functions access resources in a VPC? No, Lambda functions cannot access VPC resources. Yes, but only for read operations. Yes, but only for write operations. Yes, with appropriate VPC configuration. AWS Lambda functions can access resources in a VPC by configuring the function to connect to the VPC with appropriate security groups and subnet settings. What is the purpose of AWS Lambda's event source mapping? To store events in S3. To monitor events from multiple sources. To create a new event source. To associate an event source with a Lambda function. Event source mapping in AWS Lambda is used to associate an event source, such as an SQS queue or Kinesis stream, with a Lambda function to process incoming events. Which of the following is true about AWS Lambda's integration with API Gateway? It enables creating RESTful APIs that trigger Lambda functions. It secures Lambda functions. It provides monitoring for Lambda functions. It stores data processed by Lambda. Amazon API Gateway can be used to create, publish, and secure APIs that trigger AWS Lambda functions upon HTTP requests. What is the purpose of AWS Lambda's dead letter queue? To queue synchronous invocations. To capture failed asynchronous invocations. To manage function timeouts. To store function logs. AWS Lambda's dead letter queue captures failed asynchronous invocations, allowing you to analyze and troubleshoot errors. What does AWS Lambda use to run code? Bare metal servers. Virtual machines. Docker containers. Execution environments. AWS Lambda uses execution environments to run code, which are lightweight and managed by AWS. How can you manage permissions for an AWS Lambda function? Using AWS Cost Explorer. Using Amazon VPC. Using AWS Direct Connect. Using AWS Identity and Access Management. Permissions for AWS Lambda functions are managed using AWS Identity and Access Management. What does AWS Lambda automatically monitor? Storage using Amazon S3. Functions using Amazon CloudWatch. Network traffic using AWS VPC. Databases using Amazon RDS. AWS Lambda automatically monitors functions using Amazon CloudWatch, providing metrics like invocation count, duration, and error count. Which AWS service can be used to invoke AWS Lambda functions on a schedule? Amazon CloudWatch Events. AWS Snowball. AWS Direct Connect. Amazon Guard Duty. Amazon CloudWatch events can be used to invoke AWS Lambda functions based on a schedule you define, similar to a cron job. How is AWS Lambda built? Based on the number of users accessing the service. Based on the number of requests and the duration of code execution. Based on the number of virtual machines used. Based on the amount of storage used. AWS Lambda pricing is based on the number of requests for your functions and the time your code executes, rounded up to the nearest millisecond. How can AWS Lambda functions be versioned? By using archives. By using snapshots. By using aliases and versions. By using backups. AWS Lambda supports versioning of functions, allowing you to publish one or more versions of your Lambda function. Aliases can be used to manage different versions. What is the main advantage of using AWS Lambda with Amazon DynamoDB streams? To secure DynamoDB data. To process real-time data changes. To query DynamoDB data. To back up DynamoDB data. AWS Lambda can be triggered by Amazon DynamoDB streams to process real-time data changes, such as inserts, updates, and deletes. What is the maximum payload size that can be sent to an AWS Lambda function? 256 kilobytes for synchronous invocation. 6 megabytes for synchronous invocation. 10 megabytes for synchronous invocation. 1 megabyte for synchronous invocation. The maximum payload size for a synchronous invocation of an AWS Lambda function is 6 megabytes. What is the AWS Lambda console editor? A tool for monitoring function performance. A service for managing function permissions. A feature for configuring function timeouts. A built-in code editor for writing and modifying functions. The AWS Lambda console editor is a built-in code editor that allows you to write and modify your function code directly in the AWS Management Console. What is the AWS Lambda console? An IDE for writing Lambda code. A web-based user interface for managing Lambda functions. A monitoring tool for Lambda functions. A command line tool for deploying Lambda functions. The AWS Lambda console is a web-based interface where you can create, configure, and manage your AWS Lambda functions. What is AWS Lambda's limit on function timeout settings? 30 minutes. 20 minutes. 15 minutes. 10 minutes. The maximum timeout setting for an AWS Lambda function is 15 minutes. And that's a wrap. Thanks to everyone who participated. Remember, you can answer along on quizalto.com, where you can keep track of your progress and find much more quizzes. We hope you had a fun and challenging time. Until next time. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel for more. Hit the bell icon to be notified as soon as we upload. Please leave a comment if you have any thoughts or suggestions, and, if you think this video is worth sharing with someone who could benefit from it, please forward a link to them. See you next time. Thanks for watching.